Clara knelt on the cold kitchen floor, her hands pressing against a jagged gash in her palm as shattered crystal from the heirloom chandelier glittered like diamonds in her blood. Across the room, her mother Evelyn stood frozen, the fountain pen still trembling in her hand, while a ruthless stranger smirked, tucking the signed deed to the ancestral estate into his breast pocket. The house was gone, the legacy was erased, and the silence that had suffocated 3 generations of Whitfield women had finally claimed its final victim. As the heavy engines of the demolition crew roared to life outside, shaking the very foundation of the mansion, Clara looked at the piano bench where a single, unsent letter lay hidden, a raw confession of a love that had been weaponized into a prison. She had sacrificed everything to find the truth buried in a flooded basement, only to realize she was decades too late. Now, with the developers closing in and her daughter Maya watching the family's destruction in horrific real time, Clara had to answer the one question that had haunted the bloodline for a century. Who was the monster that had forced Evelyn to sign away their lives before the sun even went down? Oh, the water hissed through the cracks in the ceiling like a living thing, thick and hungry. Clara Whitfield's boots sank into the muck with a wet schlick, the cold seeping through the rubber soles, numbing her toes. She yanked another sodden box from the shelf, the cardboard collapsing under her fingers, pages sticking together in clumps. The ink bled into the pulp, centuries of handwritten ledgers, student essays, yellowed newspaper clippings, all dissolving into the same brown sludge. This was the basement of the decommissioned high school, a cavernous, waterlogged crypt that felt as though it were breathing in the damp, stagnant air of North Carolina's humidity. Above her, the world was moving toward a sunset that carried a death warrant for this building. The demolition crew was already idling their engines outside, the low thrum of heavy machinery vibrating through the foundation, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the minutes until the structure was leveled into dust. Clara wiped a streak of grime across her forehead, her hazel eyes scanning the rising water. It wasn't just the rain. A pipe had burst somewhere deep in the skeletal plumbing of the school, and the murky liquid was now mid-calf, swirling with debris in the gray silt of dissolving drywall. She felt the weight of every year she had spent as a librarian pressing down on her shoulders. These weren't just papers. They were the ghost voices of a town that was being systematically erased to make room for luxury condos. She reached for a crate of historical archives, her muscles screaming in protest. The air was thick with the stench of rot and wet paper, a cloying smell that seemed to coat the back of her throat. She had 47 minutes to save what remained of a century, and the water was rising faster than she could move. A shadow moved in the doorway, momentarily blocking the sickly gray light filtering through the cracked windows high above. Clara didn't turn. She knew the silhouette, the sharp angles of the shoulders, the restless energy that radiated even in silence. If you're here to gawk, save it. Grab the plastic bins from the corner, she said, her voice strained but controlled. Maya didn't answer immediately. She stood there, arms crossed over her oversized band tee, her dark bob tucked behind ears that were likely ringing with the loud music she used to drown out the world. The silence between them stretched, thick as the mildew clinging to the walls, a physical barrier that Clara had spent the last 3 years trying to dismantle without success. Maya finally stepped forward, her Doc Martens splashing into the water with a deliberate, heavy thud. She didn't reach for a box. Instead, she tracked the way Clara's hands trembled as she pried apart a stack of yearbooks. The girl's eyes were bloodshot, her expression a mask of sullen indifference that cut deeper than the cold water. "You really think this matters?" Maya's voice was flat, an edge of cynicism sharpened by years of watching her mother prioritize the past over the present. A bunch of old papers no one's read in decades? The building is coming down, Mom. Let it go. The words were a mirror of the very rift that divided them. Clara clinging to every scrap of history to prove her life hadn't been a failure, and Maya desperate to burn it all down just to see if anything real was underneath. Clara didn't look up. She felt the sting of the remark, but funneled that hurt into her grip on the next crate. "It matters to the kid who wrote the essay on the top shelf," she whispered, her voice dropping to that razor-thin level she used when she was most pushed. "The one about his dad dying in the war. His name is still in the index. You think he'd want it buried under concrete?" She nodded toward the sagging bookshelf, where the wood was bowing under the weight of waterlogged textbooks. Maya's jaw tightened, her fingers twitching at her sides. For a second, Clara thought the girl would turn and bolt back into the safety of her teenage silence. Instead, Maya grabbed the rusted fire axe leaning against the wall and swung it into a locked archive cabinet with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. 46 minutes, Maya said, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp energy. "Hurry up." The physical labor became a frantic dance against the clock. Clara hauled the heavy crates, her breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded in the damp chill of the basement. She moved the collection to the highest ground available, a rusted metal desk in the center of the room that still seemed stable. Every movement was a struggle against the slick, mud-caked floor. The encroaching mud was a thick, brown sludge that threatened to pull her under, or at least pin her to the spot until the bulldozers arrived. She could feel the desperation clawing at her chest, a high-stakes rescue mission where the prize was a history that no one else seemed to want. Maya worked beside her in a grim, silent rhythm, the two of them moving like ghosts in a drowned world, their shared trauma manifesting in the violent way they tossed the salvaged items onto the desk. The structural integrity of the basement was failing. Above them, a rotted wooden shelf, bloated to twice its size by the flood, began to groan. It was a deep, guttural sound, the protest of timber that had reached its breaking point. Clara looked up just as the wood splintered. The shelf was positioned directly above Maya, who was bent over a box of old photographs, oblivious to the mountain of accumulated debris and waterlogged ledgers about to descend. The world seemed to slow, the flickering fluorescent light above casting jagged, stuttering shadows across the scene. Clara didn't think. She didn't have the luxury of time. She saw the heavy masonry at the edge of the shelf begin to slide, a killing weight aimed at her daughter's head. With a desperate cry that tore from her throat, Clara dived across the slick floor. Her boots lost their grip on the muck, and she slid, her body becoming a projectile. She slammed into Maya, the force of the impact sending both of them sprawling into the shallow, murky lake. A split second later, the shelf collapsed with a deafening roar. Timber, bricks, and hundreds of pounds of wet paper slammed into the spot where Maya had been standing. The splash sent a wave of cold, filthy water over them, choking Clara as she scrambled to find her footing. She used her own body as a shield, bracing for a secondary collapse, her arms wrapped tightly around Maya's shaking frame. The girl was gasping, her black hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with a terror that finally broke through the icy mask of her indifference. They didn't stay down. The sound of the first collapse triggered a secondary groan from the surrounding storage units. Clara grabbed Maya's arm, her fingers digging into the girl's skin. "Move, now!" she screamed. They scrambled through the slick mud, their limbs heavy and uncoordinated, sliding and falling only to drag each other back up. They reached a stable corner of the basement, huddling near the emergency exit as another section of shelving gave way behind them. The air was thick with dust and the smell of pulverized stone. They stood there, trembling from the physical exertion and the sheer, raw adrenaline of the brush with death. For the first time in years, the wall between them wasn't made of silence. It was made of the shared, frantic beating of their hearts. As the dust began to settle, Clara's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off the turbulent water. The collapse had torn a hole in the plaster of the far wall, revealing a hidden compartment behind a loose brick that had been concealed for decades by the heavy library shelving. Something glinted in the gap, a metallic sheen that didn't belong to the rusted pipes or the debris. Clara stepped forward, her curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. She reached into the dark, narrow space and pulled out a rusted metal biscuit tin. It was heavy, the lid sealed shut by years of oxidation and grime. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she wiped away the muck, the object feeling unnaturally cold in her hands. She didn't wait to find a tool. Clara pried at the lid with her fingernails, ignoring the way the jagged metal bit into her skin. With a screech of protesting iron, the tin popped open. Inside, protected from the flood by a layer of wax paper, was a cache of frantic, handwritten letters. Clara's breath hitched. She recognized the elegant, looping script immediately. It was the handwriting of her mother, Evelyn, but not the measured, cold hand Clara remembered from the few postcards she'd received over the years. This ink was hurried, the letters jagged and overlapping, written with a desperation that vibrated off the page. These were documents that had been hidden intentionally, buried in the dark to prevent the truth from ever coming to light. Clara pulled the first letter from the stack, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it into the water. The date at the top was from 1953. As she scanned the lines, the world around her, the flooded basement, the ticking clock, the looming demolition, faded into a distant hum. The letters were addressed to Martha, Clara's grandmother, the woman who had ruled the Whitfield family with an iron fist until the day she died. But they weren't business correspondence. They were frantic pleas for help. "I cannot do this alone," Evelyn had written. "She is watching me, Martha. I feel like I'm disappearing." Clara realized with a jolt of nausea that her entire understanding of her mother was a fabrication. Evelyn hadn't been indifferent. She had been a victim of a systemic, calculated neglect. A woman begging for a lifeline that was never thrown. The heavy thud of boots on the basement stairs shattered the moment. The school janitor, Larry Henderson, stepped into the water, his round face flushed, his watery blue eyes darting toward the tin in Clara's hands. He didn't look like the bumbling, forgettable man who usually emptied the trash. There was a meanness in his posture, a sharp, focused aggression. "That's not yours, Clara," he said, his voice high and nervous. "That box was supposed to stay in the wall. Give it here." He stepped toward them, his hands out, his fingers twitching. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The danger was no longer the falling ceiling or the rising water. It was the man standing between them and the only exit. Larry didn't wait for her to answer. He lunged, his boots splashing wildly. "Evelyn paid me," he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate sort of honesty. "She paid me years ago to make sure certain things never left this building. Those boxes were supposed to be burned, not salvaged. I was just waiting for the crew to get here so I could toss them in the fire." The admission hit Clara like a physical blow. Her mother had conspired with this man to erase her own history, to ensure that Clara would never know the woman behind the mask. It was a long-standing conspiracy of silence, a final act of erasure. Clara clutched the tin to her chest, her knuckles white, her hazel eyes turning into flint. "You're not touching this," Clara whispered, her voice dropping to that deadly, razor-thin level. She felt Maya step up behind her, the girl's presence a solid, unyielding weight. The janitor hesitated, his gaze flickering between the two women and the fire axe Maya still held loosely in her hand. The revelation that her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, that her mother's coldness was a symptom of a wound rather than a character flaw, marked a permanent shift in Clara's identity. The Whitfield silence was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a cage she was determined to break. She looked at Maya, and for the first time, she saw her daughter not as a project to be fixed, but as a partner in a war that had started long before either of them was born. The urgency of the basement discovery was eclipsed the following morning by a fresh betrayal. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, the rusted biscuit tin resting among the unpaid bills and half-empty coffee mugs, when her eyes snagged on a legal notice in the local newspaper. The print seemed to blur and refocus. A formal announcement that Evelyn Whitfield had put the ancestral tobacco farm up for sale. The closing deadline was set for 24 hours from now. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. The farm wasn't just land. It was the bones of their history, the place where the letters in the tin had been conceived. If the sale went through, the developers would level the mansion, pave over the fields, and bury the truth of Evelyn's life under a layer of asphalt. "We have to go," Clara said. Standing so abruptly, her chair screeched against the linoleum. Maya looked up from her cereal, her eyes tracking the frantic way Clara began stuffing the letters into her bag. "The farm. She's selling it, Maya. If we don't get there now, we lose everything." They hurried out to the parking lot of their apartment complex, the morning air thick with the stifling humidity of a North Carolina summer. But when Clara turned the key in the ignition, the car groaned and slumped. She stepped out, her heart sinking, to find all 4 of her tires slashed. The rubber was cut deep and precise, a professional job. This wasn't random vandalism. It was industrial sabotage designed to keep her pinned down while the clock ran out on the Whitfield legacy. Suspicion curdled in Clara's gut. The janitor, Larry, or perhaps someone even more powerful, was watching her. She looked around the quiet parking lot, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Without a car, they were stranded. And the library, the place where the mystery had begun, felt like the only place left to turn for clues or help. They retreated back toward the school, the walk feeling like a gauntlet. When they entered the library to gather the last of their personal items, the atmosphere had shifted. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. As they stood in the main hall, a sudden, violent snap echoed from the ceiling. Clara looked up just in time to see the heavy crystal chandelier, its chain cleanly severed, plummeting toward her. She threw herself backward, the wind of the falling object whistling past her face. The chandelier shattered against the floor in a spray of glass and brass, the sound a deafening explosion in the empty room. "Mom!" Maya screamed, reaching for her. Clara scrambled up, her hands bleeding from the glass shards, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. This was no longer a game of secrets. It was a hunt. Someone was willing to use lethal force to ensure the biscuit tin was returned or destroyed. The security that supposedly patrolled the decommissioned building was nowhere to be found. Or worse, they were the ones pulling the strings. Clara grabbed Maya's hand and bolted for the stairs, heading toward the second-floor stacks. She needed a place to hide, a place where the narrow aisles could work in her favor. But as they reached the shadows of the upper floor, a man stepped out from behind a row of oversized reference books. He wore a dark uniform, a security guard patch pinned to a chest that looked like a slab of granite. This was Derek Cole, a man built for violence, his shaved head gleaming under the flickering emergency lights. He didn't say a word. He just held out a massive, scarred hand, his eyes fixed on the bag containing the letters. The struggle was brief and desperate. Derek lunged, his movements surprisingly fast for a man of his size. Clara dodged, swinging her heavy bag like a flail, but he caught her arm, his grip like a vice. "Give it over, lady. It's not worth your life," he growled. Clara felt the familiar surge of wildness that came when she was cornered. She reached out and grabbed the heaviest book within reach, a massive, leather-bound volume of Durham County legal precedents. With a grunt of effort, she slammed the spine of the book into the guard's face. The impact was sickeningly solid. He roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Clara to twist free. She didn't wait for him to recover. "The ladder, Maya! Help me!" They grabbed the rolling library ladder, its wheels screaming on the metal tracks. With a coordinated shove, they pushed the heavy structure off its rails. It fell with a crashing thud, creating a tangled barrier of wood and metal that trapped the guard in the narrow aisle. Behind the fallen ladder, a shelf of encyclopedias began to tip, a slow-motion avalanche of paper that buried the guard's legs. Clara and Maya didn't stay to watch. They sprinted for the fire exit, their lungs burning, the humid night air hitting them like a physical weight as they burst out onto the street. They didn't stop running until they reached a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away, a neon-lit sanctuary smelling of burnt coffee and grease. Clara sat in a vinyl booth, her hands still shaking as she spread the letters out on the formica table. Maya sat opposite her, silent for once, her dark eyes fixed on the yellowed paper. Clara began to read the remaining letters, her voice a low whisper that barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. The truth began to assemble itself like a jagged puzzle. These weren't just cries for help. They were a record of a war. The pivotal letter was dated 1962. In it, Martha's tone had shifted from indifference to outright malice. Clara's breath caught as she realized the extent of the sabotage. Martha hadn't just ignored Evelyn's attempts to be a mother. She had actively blackmailed her. "If you take the child and leave," Martha had written, "I will ensure the tobacco contracts are voided by morning. You will have nothing to feed her. You will be a vagrant, and I will have the courts declare you unfit." Martha had used the family business as a noose, forcing Evelyn into a role of emotional coldness to protect Clara's very survival. The Ice Queen Clara had grown up with was a woman who had frozen her own heart to keep her daughter from starving. "She wasn't cold, Maya," Clara whispered, a tear finally escaping and smudging the ink on the page. "She was a prisoner. Martha broke her so she wouldn't break the business." The epiphany was a tidal wave, washing away decades of resentment. Clara looked at her daughter, seeing the same guarded expression Maya had worn for years, and realized she had been repeating the cycle, using silence as a shield, just as Evelyn had. The first real crack appeared in Maya's wall. The girl reached across the table, her bitten-down fingernails grazing Clara's hand. "We have to stop them, Mom. We can't let them take the house." Clara's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. "We're going to the mansion," she said, her voice steady. "Sunday dinner. The whole family will be there, and the developers too. We're going to stage an intervention. We're going to break the silence once and for all." She knew the clock was ticking. The sale was set to close by the end of the next day. Но она больше не боялась теней. Она была Уитфилдом, и у нее наконец-то были слова, чтобы защитить себя. The drive to the Whitfield ancestral tobacco farm was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The long, winding driveway was crowded not with the familiar beat-up trucks of the locals, but with sleek, black luxury SUVs and German sedans. Clara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Evelyn hadn't just put the house up for sale, she was hosting a wake for it. "Stay close to me," Clara murmured to Maya, as they stepped onto the sagging porch. The air was thick with the scent of rotting magnolias and expensive cologne, a jarring combination that signaled the end of an era. Inside, the grand dining room was a theater of forced civility. Evelyn sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her silver hair pulled into a chignon so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a mask of perpetual surprise. She was surrounded by men in sharp suits, ruthless investors and lawyers who looked at the house like a carcass to be picked clean. Richard Whitfield, a distant cousin with a smile as smooth as oil, stood by the sideboard, pouring wine. When Clara entered, the conversation didn't stop. It just shifted gears into a patronizing, hollow professionalism. "Clara, dear, you're late," Evelyn said, her voice clipped and measured, never rising above a whisper. She didn't look at Clara's muddy boots or the bandage on her hand. She looked at the legal documents spread across the table like a shroud. The lead developer, a man named Julian with eyes like a shark, raised a crystal glass. A toast to the future, then, to Whitfield Meadows. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Clara felt like she was drowning again, but this time the water was made of ink and money. Evelyn avoided her gaze, her fingers trembling as she reached for the gold-plated pen. Clara felt the need to find something, anything, to break Evelyn's trance. She excused herself, slipping into the parlor while the men laughed at a joke about zoning laws. The room was a tomb of velvet and dust. She moved to the old piano, the one Henry Dawson used to tune before Martha chased him away. On a whim, she pressed the hidden release on the piano bench. Inside, buried under old sheet music, was a single, unsent envelope. It was addressed to Clara. The paper was fresh, the ink dark. It was a raw, vulnerable confession of love and regret, written in Evelyn's own hand only weeks ago. "I did it for you," it read. "I let her take my soul so she wouldn't take yours." Clara clutched the letter and marched back into the dining room. "Mother, we need to talk. Privately. Now." Julian, the developer, stepped into her path, his broad shoulders blocking the way to Evelyn. He sneered, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "The lady is busy, Clara. Don't interfere with adult business." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip tightening. The air in the room spiked with a sudden, violent tension. Clara saw Maya's face go pale, her daughter's eyes darting toward the exit. The struggle erupted in the kitchen. Clara tried to bypass Julian, her movements fueled by a desperate, frantic energy. He shoved her back, and she stumbled against the butcher block table. A tray of crystal glassware, set out for the final course, caught her elbow and shattered against the floor. Clara felt a sharp, searing heat in her palm as she came down on the shards. "Enough!" she screamed, holding up her bloody hand. The piano bench letter clutched between her fingers. "Look at this, Mother. Look at your own words." Evelyn remained frozen, her hand hovering over the final signature page of the contract. Julian pressured her, his voice a hiss of urgency. "Ignore her, Evelyn. She's hysterical. Just sign, and it's over. You can finally be free." Clara ignored the blood dripping onto the linoleum. "You're not free if you sell the truth. Look at me." But the hammer fell before the blow could land. Evelyn looked up, her pale blue eyes watery and hollow. "It's too late, Clara," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "I signed the papers an hour before you arrived. The house is already gone. It's not ours anymore." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the developer's luxury cars. Clara stood humiliated, her hand bleeding, the ruins of her family's history literally crunching under her feet. Julian laughed, a wet, triumphant sound. "I orchestrated those accidents at the library, Clara. I wanted to make sure you didn't find anything that would slow us down. But it doesn't matter now. We have the land. We have the name. And you? You have nothing." He looked at Maya, a cruel smirk twisting his mouth. "Broken by design, aren't you?" Just like the rest of the Whitfield women, the insult was the spark that hit the powder keg. Clara felt her librarian's precision override her despair. She looked at the legal deeds spread across the table, her mind cataloging the details with the speed of a researcher on a deadline. She saw a boundary record mentioned in the historical letters from the biscuit tin, a specific land grant from 1890. She looked at the modern contract. A glaring legal discrepancy leapt out at her. "You're wrong, Julian," she said, her voice a sudden, authoritative roar that silenced the room. "Martha never legally owned the North acreage. My great-grandmother left it in a private trust that Martha bypassed through fraud. If she didn't own it, Evelyn had no right to sell it. The Whitfield silence didn't just break, it shattered." Clara laid out the evidence, her voice steady and unrelenting, exposing the fraudulent nature of the land transfer that Martha had used to maintain control. She forced Evelyn to look at the physical evidence of the letters, the proof of the multi-generational trauma that had dictated their lives. Evelyn's stoic mask finally crumbled. She grabbed the water-damaged papers, her shoulders slumping as she began to weep. The sound a guttural release of 40 years of suppressed grief. The final twist struck Julian like a physical blow. As Evelyn scrutinized the documents, she realized that Julian wasn't just a developer. He was a distant cousin who had intentionally orchestrated the accidents to hide his own fraudulent claim to the estate. His interest wasn't in luxury condos. It was in burying the evidence of his own family's betrayal. Evelyn stood up, her posture regaining its severe, regal height. "Get out," she said to the room of stunned men. "The sale is revoked. The deeds are invalid. And if you ever step foot on this land again, I will ensure you spend the rest of your lives in a cell." Julian attempted to seize the documents by force, but Maya stepped forward, her phone held high. "I've been recording everything, Julian. The threats, the confession about the library, the fraud. It's already uploading to the cloud. Move, and I hit send to the sheriff." The girl's voice was steady, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. The developers fled the mansion, their luxury cars kicking up gravel as they raced away from the ruins of their deal. The house was saved on a technicality, but the real victory was the quiet that followed. Clara sat on the porch with Evelyn and Maya, the three of them watching the first light of dawn touch the overgrown tobacco fields. They spoke openly, the contents of the letters finally shared, the air between them clearing of the shadows that Martha had cast so long ago. As the sun rose, Maya finally reached out and took Clara's hand, a gesture of reconciliation that felt more solid than any deed. The cycle of silence was broken. For the first time in North Carolina history, a Whitfield woman breathed freely. The past no longer a cage, but a foundation.